My name is Elijah, and like many of you, I've striven to follow God, but my journey has been marked by doubt. I was raised in a family where prayer was everything. My grandmother would wake before dawn, whispering ancient supplications passed down for generations, her voice trembling with devotion. My mother prayed as she cooked, as she worked, as she wept. But me, I prayed because I was supposed to, not because I always believed it worked. There were too many moments when I had begged, pleaded, and yet silence met me in return. It wasn't that I lacked faith in God. I lacked faith in my own voice. Did he really hear me? Did he truly care about my words, or were they just one among the millions rising to the heavens, getting lost in the endless echoes of need? I remember the night before it happened. I sat by my window looking up at the sky, my hands clasped together. God, I whispered, if my prayers really matter, show me. If I've been doing it wrong all these years, tell me. My chest tightened, the weight of unanswered prayers pressing against me like a stone. There were things I had prayed for that never came. There were people I had prayed for who still suffered. I wanted to believe, but I needed something more than blind faith. The next day, I was driving home from work when the accident happened. A truck, headlights glaring, swerved into my lane. I remember the screech of tires, the impact, the world flipping as metal twisted around me. And then, nothing, darkness. But it wasn't empty, it wasn't cold. It was the deepest silence I had ever known, a silence that wrapped around me, weightless and infinite. And then, light. A glow that grew, expanding until I could feel warmth sinking into my skin. I was standing, though I had no memory of rising. The air around me shimmered, vibrating with something beyond sound. It wasn't the golden gates or the pearly halls I had imagined heaven to be. It was something else, something that felt impossibly familiar. A vast expanse stretched before me, rolling hills, a sky that pulsed with light, colors richer than anything I had ever seen. I heard voices, not speaking but singing, a chorus so deep it resonated in my bones. And then I saw him. Jesus, not in the way I had seen him in paintings or imagined in Sunday school stories. He stood before me, clothed in brilliance, yet there was nothing distant about him. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant I felt everything I had ever doubted dissolve. He knew me. Not just my prayers, not just my faith, but my fears, my struggles, the moments I had wanted to give up. Elijah, he said, and his voice was the voice I had been waiting to hear my entire life. I fell to my knees, not because I had to, but because it was the only response that made sense. "My Lord," I whispered, my voice breaking. He stepped closer, reaching down, lifting me with a touch lighter than air. "You have asked about prayer," he said. "You have wondered if your words reached me." Tears burned my eyes. I tried. I tried to believe, but sometimes I didn't know if you were listening. A soft smile. Not one of rebuke, not one of disappointment, but of understanding. "Come," he said, and as he turned, the world around us shifted. I saw them. Prayers. They hung in the air like threads of light, stretching beyond sight. Some shimmered, vibrant and full of energy, pulsing like living things. Others were faint, flickering, barely visible. Some were tangled together, weaving into intricate patterns. "These," Jesus said, motioning toward them, "are the prayers of my people." I reached out, my fingers brushing one of the threads. A rush of warmth surged through me, and suddenly I could hear the words that had been spoken. A mother praying for her son. A child whispering a bedtime prayer. A desperate plea from a man at the end of his rope. Tears streamed down my face. "They're all here," Jesus nodded. "Not a single one is lost. Not a single one goes unheard." "Then why?" my voice caught. "Why do some go unanswered?" He turned to me, his eyes deep with something I could not yet name. "You misunderstand, Elijah. No prayer is unanswered. Some are answered in ways you do not see. Some are answered in ways you do not expect. And some are not requests, but invitations." I frowned. Invitations. He reached out, and with a simple motion, the threads began to shift, revealing something deeper beneath them. I gasped. I saw moments of my life, times when I had prayed for one thing, only to be led to something greater. Prayers I thought had gone unheard, only to realize they had shaped my path in ways I had never recognized. You pray as if I am far away, Jesus said gently. But prayer is not a request shouted across a distance. Prayer is a joining, a becoming. It is not only words, it is alignment. I could barely breathe. Alignment with what? With me. He motioned, and suddenly I saw them. Prayers spoken from the heart, prayers that resonated so deeply with God's will that they burned like fire. These were the prayers that changed things instantly, not because they were more powerful, but because they were in perfect harmony with Him. And then He showed me something else. There were prayers spoken in fear, in doubt, in desperation. These were not ignored. They too were caught in the great tapestry of light, but they had been rerouted, shaped, molded. Not abandoned, but transformed. I trembled. So all this time you were listening, a deep, knowing look. Always. I thought of the prayers I had whispered in the night, the ones I had abandoned, thinking they had faded into nothing. But they hadn't. They had been heard. They had been answered, not in the ways I had expected, but in the ways I had needed. My knees buckled, but Jesus caught me. Then how should I pray? I asked. He smiled. Pray not as a beggar, but as a child. Pray not as though you must convince me, but as though you already walk with me. And above all, pray in trust. Trust that I am good. Trust that I know what is best. Trust that I am always working, even when you do not see it. I wept. Not in sorrow, but in awe, because for the first time in my life I understood. The realization settled over me like a wave, both weightless and overwhelming. For years, I had prayed as though I needed to capture God's attention, as though I needed to say the right words in the right way to be heard. I had measured my faith by whether or not my prayers were answered in the way I expected. But now, standing before Jesus, watching the endless threads of prayer stretch out into eternity, I saw the truth. Every prayer had always been heard, even the ones I had forgotten, even the ones I had whispered in doubt. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. But what about the prayers that feel unanswered? The ones that leave people broken? My voice shook, carrying years of buried sorrow. What about the ones that are met with silence? Jesus extended His hand, and in an instant the air shimmered. I found myself standing in the middle of a storm. The wind roared around me, the sky dark with fury. Lightning cracked across the heavens, illuminating the chaos for the briefest of moments before darkness swallowed it again. I flinched as the storm howled, pressing against me with an unseen force. "Why are we here?" I shouted over the wind. Jesus' voice was steady, unshaken. This is the storm of human understanding. It rages when prayers do not unfold as expected, when grief and pain blind the heart. I struggled to stand, the wind pulling at me. But why does it happen? Why do some prayers, desperate, pleading prayers, seem to go unanswered? Jesus turned His gaze to the churning sky. Because my people often pray for what they think will bring them peace, but I answer with what will truly lead them to it. With a wave of His hand, the storm shifted. I saw moments, flashes of time suspended in the chaos. A woman praying for healing, only to pass from this world and find eternal peace in my presence. A man pleading for financial security, only to be led instead toward a path of deep trust and provision he never expected. A child crying out in fear, unaware that unseen angels stood guard over them. I turned to him, my throat tight. "So we're not being ignored, we just don't understand the answers." Jesus nodded. "You see only a thread, Elijah. I see the entire tapestry." The storm faded, replaced once more by the radiant expanse of the heavenly realm. But now I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't just an endless weaving of prayers. It was a story. A living, breathing story being written by the hand of God. And we, in our limited understanding, only saw the moments, not the masterpiece. Jesus stepped closer. "You have seen what few are allowed to see. Now you must carry this truth back with you. A cold fear settled in my stomach. But how? How do I explain this? People are suffering. They feel abandoned. How do I tell them they are heard when their hearts are breaking? Jesus reached out, touching my forehead, and in an instant memories surged through me. I saw my own life, my own struggles, the moments when I had felt forsaken. Only now I saw them with new eyes. The unanswered prayers that had led me toward greater blessings. The times I had thought God was silent, only to realize He had been working in ways I could not see. I gasped, staggering under the weight of it all. "You must tell them," Jesus said, His voice filled with an urgency I could not ignore. "Teach them to pray not in fear but in faith, not as though they are separate from me but as those who already dwell in my presence. Prayer is not about changing my will, it is about aligning with it." Tears blurred my vision. But what if they don't believe me? What if I fail? Jesus smiled, the kind of smile that held eternity in it. "The truth does not require belief to be true. You were chosen for this, Elijah. You were meant to see." The weight of His words settled deep in my soul. And then the light around me began to dim. A pull, gentle yet undeniable, tugged at me. My time here was ending. Panic gripped me. "Wait, I'm not ready." Jesus raised a hand. "You are." The world collapsed into light and then pain. I gasped, lungs burning as air flooded back into them. My body ached. The harsh scent of antiseptic filled my nostrils. Beeping machines, muffled voices. A hospital. I was back. Tears spilled down my cheeks as the reality settled over me. I had died. I had been with Him. And now I was here again with a truth so vast I could barely contain it. I closed my eyes, the echo of His voice still ringing in my soul. I knew what I had to do. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. I had returned to life with a new purpose, one that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The truth Jesus had shown me was heavy, too big to contain, and yet I couldn't ignore it. Every prayer, every word, every thought that I had once believed to be insignificant had been part of something far greater than I had understood. I wasn't simply praying to a distant God. I was engaging in a divine dance, an active participation in His plan. But how do you share something so profound? How do you explain that prayer is not about asking for what we want, but about aligning our will with God's? How do you tell people who have suffered, who have begged for relief, that their prayers have not gone unheard? I spent weeks in silence, wrestling with the enormity of what I had experienced. I tried to go back to my old ways, to pray as I had before, but everything felt different. The words seemed empty, shallow, and I realized I couldn't just go through the motions anymore. I had to live what I had learned. I had to be the prayer, not just speak it, but it wasn't easy. I had doubts. I questioned myself at every turn. How could I explain this to people who were hurting? How could I help them see what I had seen? I had been given a glimpse into something so much greater, and yet the world around me seemed unaware, too focused on their own pain to understand. There were moments when I almost gave up, when the weight of the responsibility felt too great. But then I remembered what Jesus had said. "You were chosen for this, Elijah. You were meant to see." I began to pray differently, not to ask for things, but to align my heart with God's will. I began to pray for understanding, for strength, for wisdom. I prayed for my community, for the people who were lost and suffering. I prayed not out of desperation, but out of a deep trust that God was working, even when I couldn't see it. And as I prayed, something began to shift. I felt God's presence more acutely than ever before. I could sense His work in the world, moving through people, through situations, through the quiet moments of life. I saw the beauty in the brokenness, the grace in the struggle. Then came the day when I knew I had to speak out. I stood before a small group of friends, my heart racing. They had known me before the accident, before everything had changed. They knew my doubts, my struggles. But now I had to show them something different. I had to tell them the truth I had seen. I began, my voice trembling at first, but as the words flowed, I found a confidence I had never known before. Prayer is not what we think it is, I said, the truth pouring from me. It's not just a way to ask for things, to beg for blessings. Prayer is a conversation, a partnership with God. It's about aligning ourselves with His will, not just asking for things. It's about trusting that He knows what's best for us, even when we don't understand. And sometimes, the answers come in ways we can't even imagine. I saw the confusion in their eyes, the skepticism, but I also saw something else, hope, a flicker of understanding. I told them about the storm I had witnessed, about the prayers that had been answered in ways I had never understood until I saw them with God's eyes. I shared the vision of the threads, how every prayer, no matter how small or desperate, was part of something beautiful and eternal. By the time I finished, the room was silent. They didn't know what to make of it all, but I could see the seeds of something taking root in their hearts. And then one of them spoke up. "I've always prayed for things, for healing, for help with my family, my finances," she said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "But I've never thought about prayer like that. Maybe it's time I prayed differently. Maybe it's time I prayed to be in alignment with God's will, instead of just asking for what I want." I nodded, my heart swelling with a mixture of awe and gratitude. It was happening. They were beginning to understand. In the weeks that followed, I shared the message with others, friends, family, strangers. And each time the reaction was the same: confusion, then curiosity, and eventually, a deeper understanding. I realized I was not alone in my struggle. There were others out there who had felt the same way I had, who had wondered if their prayers were truly heard. And slowly, the community began to change. People started to pray not just for answers, but for alignment with God's will. They stopped seeing prayer as a transaction, a way to get what they wanted, and started to see it as a relationship, a partnership with the Creator of the universe. It wasn't always easy. There were still doubts, still moments of frustration, but I no longer feared those moments. I knew that God was with me, that He was guiding me, that He was always listening, even when the answers weren't what I expected. I began to see the fruit of that change in my own life. The weight of my doubts lifted. I felt a peace that I had never known before. Prayer became less of a burden and more of a joy, a conversation with my Creator, not a list of demands. I began to trust Him more deeply, knowing that His plans for me were far greater than I could ever understand. And then one day, I was sitting in a quiet park watching the sunset when it hit me. I was never meant to be the center of the story. My prayers were not meant to be about me, but about Him. I was simply a vessel, a conduit for His will to flow through. And in that realization, I found freedom. I had died, and in that death I had been reborn, not just in body but in spirit. And now I knew my purpose: to teach others what I had learned. To help them understand that prayer was not just about words, but about aligning with God's will, trusting in His timing, and having faith that He was always at work, even when we couldn't see it. Prayer had always been a gift, but now I understood it for what it truly was: a partnership with the divine. And that, more than anything, would change how I prayed forever. And so I continue to pray, not as one who begs, but as one who trusts. I pray not for answers, but for alignment. I pray not to change God's mind, but to change my own. And in that, I find peace, joy, and a deeper connection with the One who has always been with me. As I continued on this journey, a shift began to take place, not just in me, but in the lives of those around me. It wasn't overnight, and it wasn't always easy, but there was a transformation, a quiet revolution of the Spirit, that began to take root in my community. People who had once prayed with desperation, as if the fate of their lives hung on every word, started to approach prayer with a sense of peace. At first, I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened to me, let alone convince others that it was real. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when I questioned if I had truly heard God's voice in that heavenly realm, or if it was just the product of my own mind grasping for something to hold onto in a time of crisis. But then, in those quiet moments of prayer, I would feel it, the same overwhelming sense of peace and assurance that had washed over me when I was standing with Jesus. It was as though he had never left. He was always there, waiting for me to align my heart with his, to trust that his plan was already unfolding in ways I couldn't always see. I began to meet with small groups, teaching what I had learned, sharing the truths that had transformed my understanding of prayer. The response was different from what I had expected. Some people were skeptical, of course. How could I explain the indescribable? How could I tell them about the threads of prayer, the divine patterns I had glimpsed? It wasn't a message that fit neatly into any box. They couldn't just take it as fact without questioning it, without wrestling with it themselves, and I didn't blame them. But the ones who stayed, the ones who truly listened, they began to experience the change too. Slowly, their prayers shifted. They began to pray not as though they were trying to get God's attention, but as though they were already in communion with him. They prayed not out of desperation, but out of trust that he was already working. They stopped demanding answers and started listening, waiting for the still small voice that spoke so clearly in the silence. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt. There were times when prayers felt unanswered, when life didn't seem to match the truth we had been shown. But even in those moments, there was a peace. The kind of peace that comes not from having everything figured out, but from knowing that the creator of the universe was holding us, guiding us, even in the storms. And so, my life became a series of moments, small but significant, where I practiced this new way of praying, this way of aligning myself with God's will. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about my grandmother, how she had prayed for me when I was too young to understand the power of prayer. I thought about the countless moments in my life when I had prayed in desperation, unsure if anyone was listening, unsure if my prayers mattered. But now, I knew they had always mattered. Every prayer I had spoken, every prayer I had ever whispered, even in the dark places of my heart, had been part of something far bigger than I could ever have imagined. God had been listening. Not just listening, but working in ways that I would never fully understand. But the beauty of it was that I didn't need to understand. I only needed to trust. Trust that he knew what was best. Trust that he was always with me, and trust that his plans for me were good, even when they didn't look the way I had expected. It was in this trust that I found my strength. And it was in this trust that I learned how to pray with true purpose, prayers that aligned with God's will, prayers that asked for his wisdom and his peace, prayers that invited his presence into every corner of my life. As I shared this message with others, I began to see the ripple effect. One person's prayer would shift, and then another. Slowly, the community around me began to understand the power of prayer in a new way. They stopped viewing it as a way to manipulate God into doing their will, and began to see it as an opportunity to align their hearts with his. But it wasn't just about the community. It was about me too. I wasn't just teaching them. I was learning right alongside them. With every conversation, with every prayer, I was being transformed. I was learning what it meant to live in alignment with God's will, to trust that his plan for me was perfect, even when it didn't make sense in the moment. And slowly, my doubts faded. The fear that I had once carried, fear that my prayers didn't matter, fear that I was alone, began to dissipate. I knew now, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that my prayers mattered, that they were heard, that they were part of something eternal, something beautiful. It didn't mean that life was always easy. It didn't mean that every prayer I spoke would be answered the way I hoped. But it did mean that I had the assurance that God was listening, that he was always working, even in the quiet moments, even in the moments of pain. And as I sat there, reflecting on the journey, I knew that I had been changed forever. I had died. But in that death, I had been reborn, not just in body but in spirit. I had been given a new understanding of prayer, a new understanding of God's love and His will, and now I knew my purpose: to share that truth with others. To help them understand that prayer is not just a transaction with God, it is a relationship, it is a partnership, it is the most intimate way we can engage with the Creator of the universe. And so, I will continue to pray, not as one who asks, but as one who trusts. Not as one who begs, but as one who believes. Because now I know without a doubt that prayer changes everything. It changes us. It changes the world, and that, more than anything, is the greatest gift of all. As I moved forward, carrying the weight of what I had experienced, I began to see more clearly than ever the profound impact that true prayer could have on people's lives. The change was subtle at first. Small moments of understanding sparked in others, just as they had in me. Conversations would begin with a simple question about prayer, and before long, I found myself explaining the same truths I had learned. Prayer is not about asking, it's about alignment. It's not about speaking to a distant God, but about living in communion with Him, trusting that He is always at work, even when we don't see it. I started to notice the ripple effect as people shared what they had learned with others. I could see it in their eyes, this flicker of hope, of understanding, growing stronger with each passing day. Prayer, for them, began to transform from a ritual into a conversation, from a duty into a joy. They no longer prayed just to get something from God, but to draw closer to Him, to understand His heart more fully. They stopped praying for specific answers and started praying for alignment with His will. It was a beautiful shift, and it wasn't just happening in one place. It was happening everywhere I went. But there was still a deeper journey for me to embark on. As the years passed, I continued to reflect on the vision I had seen, the threads of prayer, the way each one was woven together, each one significant, none of them lost. I knew that I had been given something precious, something I couldn't just keep to myself. It wasn't enough for me to simply understand. I had to share this gift, this knowledge with others. It wasn't always easy. There were times when I was overwhelmed, when I felt unworthy of the message I was carrying. How could I, someone who had struggled with faith for so long, now be the one to lead others in prayer? But I had come to understand something powerful about God's grace. It wasn't about my worthiness. It was about His calling, and I knew I couldn't ignore that calling. So I stepped out in faith, even when the path felt uncertain. As I shared the message of aligned prayer, I saw lives changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Families who had been torn apart by years of bitterness began to heal. Relationships that had once seemed irreparable found new strength. People who had once felt distant from God started to feel His presence in ways that were undeniable. It was as though, through the power of prayer, God was stitching together the broken pieces of their lives, just as He had done for me. And yet, despite all the beauty and transformation I saw, there were still moments when I questioned. It wasn't doubt in God's power, but rather doubt in the process. There were still prayers that went unanswered, still moments of pain, still lives that seemed untouched by the healing power of prayer. And in those moments, I remembered what Jesus had shown me. Prayer isn't always about immediate results. It isn't always about seeing the fruits of our labor right away. Sometimes, prayer is about trust. Sometimes, it's about planting seeds that will grow in ways we cannot yet see. I realized that prayer was not just a tool for change. It was the very foundation of our relationship with God. It was the way we engage with Him, the way we invite Him into our lives, and the way we allow Him to shape us. It wasn't always about changing our circumstances. It was about changing our hearts, aligning them with His. It was about learning to trust in His timing, to believe that he was always working behind the scenes, even when we didn't understand. I began to embrace that trust more fully. Even when my prayers felt unanswered, I learned to rest in the peace of knowing that God was listening. Even when the answers didn't come as I expected, I learned to trust that his ways were higher than mine, that he knew what was best for me. And slowly, I realized that this trust was the key to everything. It was the foundation of true prayer, the foundation of true faith. Trusting in God's goodness, trusting in his plans, trusting that he would never leave us, never forsake us, even in our darkest moments. It was in this trust that I found my true purpose. I wasn't just meant to share the message of prayer. I was meant to live it. To pray not just for answers, but for alignment. To pray not just for my own will, but for God's. To trust that, no matter what, he was always at work in my life and in the lives of those around me. And so, I continue to pray. Not as one who begs, but as one who trusts. Not as one who asks, but as one who aligns. And in that trust I find peace, I find joy, I find purpose, because in the end, prayer is not about changing God's mind, it's about changing ours. It's about inviting him into every part of our lives, trusting that his will is good, and knowing that, no matter what, he is always with us, guiding us, leading us to a place of deeper understanding and love. And that, I have come to understand, is the true power of prayer. Not in what we ask for, but in how we align our hearts with God's. The council meeting concluded in a blur of activity as the decision was made. The elders' final words still rang in Callum's ears, a reminder of how much they had just committed to. The weight of the task ahead loomed over him, but it was the glances from Alara that lingered, heavy with meaning. She had supported him, trusted him to act, and now it was his turn to do the same. As the council dispersed, Alara and Callum remained standing by the long oval table, the soft hum of the room the only sound that filled the space between them. Alara's gaze was fixed ahead, but Callum caught the flicker of something in her expression, something both intense and vulnerable. She looked at him then, her eyes softening just slightly. "You've done more than I expected," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "We'll need your help in ways you might not even realize yet." Callum met her gaze, surprised by the depth of what she was saying. "Whatever it takes, right?" He tried to smile, but the weight of their task was settling heavily on his shoulders. The Zavani order wasn't going to back down, and even with their evidence, there was no guarantee that the truth would be enough to stop them. Alara gave a small nod, her bioluminescent markings flickering faintly in the dim light. She stepped closer, the space between them closing in a way that felt unspoken but understood. "I've seen what you're capable of," she said softly, "and I trust you." The words, simple and direct, hit Callum in a way he hadn't expected. Trust. It was something he had struggled with for years, both in himself and in others. But standing here with Alara beside him, it felt like that trust was no longer just something fragile. It was becoming a foundation. "We're going to need to move quickly," Alara continued, breaking the moment, her voice hardening with the knowledge that time was running out. "The Zavani order will make their move soon. We can't let them get ahead of us." Callum nodded, his focus shifting to the mission. "What's our first step?" Alara glanced toward the doors where the other counselors had just exited, her gaze narrowing. "We begin with a strategic strike against their communication network. It's the first move in dismantling their control." She paused, then added, her tone low, "We'll need to move fast and it's going to get dangerous. The Zavani won't let us disrupt their plans without retaliation. Then we hit them before they hit us," Callum replied, his voice firm. Alara turned her head to look at him, a glint of approval in her eyes. "Exactly. But there's more to it than that. The council will provide support, but we're the ones who will have to infiltrate their strongholds. We'll need to use your skills in both diplomacy and infiltration." He frowned, his mind working through the implications. Infiltration, that's not exactly my area of expertise. Elara's lips quirked into a half smile. No, but you've got an uncanny ability to read people. You'll adapt. Callum swallowed, uncertainty creeping in. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he could do this, not alone, not with the weight of the entire mission on his shoulders. He had failed before. What if he failed again? Elara seemed to read the hesitation in his posture, her expression softening. She placed a hand on his arm, a touch that was both grounding and intimate in a way he wasn't expecting. "You're not alone in this," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be with you. Every step." Her words, simple but resolute, settled over him, a quiet promise. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They didn't have long to prepare. The Zavani order would be making their move soon, and the council had given them the green light to strike first. Elara led him to a secure transport, and as they boarded, the hum of the engines filled the silence between them. Outside, the night sky of Netharis spread out before them, a brilliant canvas of stars that seemed to pulse in sync with the planet's energy. Callum's thoughts were scattered, but as Elara sat beside him, their proximity felt like a steadying force. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time since arriving on Netharis, he didn't feel quite so alone. The mission ahead was dangerous. He knew that. But there was something else, a pull between them that had been growing steadily, piece by piece. He couldn't deny it any longer. Elara turned to face him, her eyes soft but intense. "We'll succeed," she said, her voice low, "because we have to, for all of us." Callum's heart beat a little faster at her words. They were more than just a declaration of duty. They were a promise, and in that moment he realized how much he wanted to be part of it, whatever the cost. "Let's make sure we do," he replied, the weight of their shared commitment settling into his chest. As the transport glided through the atmosphere, heading toward their first target, Callum felt the surge of adrenaline rise in him. They were about to take the first step toward saving this world together, and as the ground below them vanished into the distance, he knew, no matter what happened next, they would face it united. As I continued on this path, the landscape of my life began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't just teaching others about prayer anymore. I was living it, breathing it, letting it shape every moment. The transformation I had undergone from a person who doubted the power of prayer to one who had seen its depth had become my daily reality. Prayer had become a part of me, woven into the very fabric of who I was. Each day, I felt more connected to God. The mundane moments of life, washing dishes, walking down the street, even just sitting quietly, became opportunities to pray, not as a ritual but as a conversation. I no longer saw prayer as a means to an end, but as an ongoing dialogue with God. In those small moments, I found the answers I had once been searching for. But still, there were days when the weight of the world pressed down on me, when the pain around me felt unbearable. I would watch the suffering, the confusion, the heartbreak that so many people still faced, and I would wonder once again why certain prayers go unanswered, why some struggles seem never-ending. It was a question I had never been able to fully resolve. Yet, in those moments, I was reminded of the truth Jesus had shown me. Prayer is not about controlling the outcome. It is about surrendering to God's will. It's not about avoiding pain, but about walking through it with the assurance that He is with us, that He is always listening. There was a time when I could have turned away from this. I could have gone back to my old ways, praying only when I needed something, only when I felt desperate. But now, I realized that the power of prayer wasn't found in asking for things. It was found in trusting God with the process. Even in the darkest times, I knew He was present. Even when the answers didn't come immediately, I knew He was working behind the scenes. I remember one night, sitting in the stillness of my room, wrestling with a prayer I had been praying for weeks. It was a prayer for someone I loved deeply, someone who was suffering in ways I couldn't bear to see. I had begged God for a solution, for healing, for a miracle. But after days of pleading, I still hadn't seen any change. I was frustrated, and a part of me wanted to give up. But then, I remembered the lesson I had learned, the one I had been teaching others. It was not about controlling the outcome. It was about surrendering to God, about trusting that He knew what was best. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and simply said, "God, I trust you with this. I trust that you see what I cannot see, that you understand what I cannot understand. Please have your way." As soon as I prayed that, a sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't the peace I had expected. There was still uncertainty, still unanswered questions. But there was a quiet assurance that, no matter what happened, God was in control. I didn't need to understand everything. I just needed to trust that His will was perfect, even in the midst of pain. The days that followed were not easy. The situation didn't resolve in the way I had hoped. But in that trust, I found a strength I hadn't known before. I was no longer living to control the outcome of my prayers. I was living in alignment with God's will, trusting that His ways were higher than mine. And in that surrender, I found peace. As I shared this experience with others, I saw the same shift in them. People who had been praying with desperation, trying to force their will onto God, began to understand that prayer was not a means of control. It was a way to align with His purpose. They began to pray not for the things they wanted, but for the things God wanted for them. And in that shift, they began to experience a deeper sense of peace, a greater sense of connection with God. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, still times when the pain seemed too much to bear. But I had learned that those moments weren't signs that God had abandoned me. They were opportunities to trust Him even more. Prayer wasn't about getting what we wanted. It was about learning to trust that God's plan was always good, even when we couldn't see the end result. And that's what I've come to understand about prayer. It is not about changing God's mind. It's about changing our own. It's about surrendering our will to His, trusting that His plans are better than our own. It's about walking with Him through the highs and the lows, knowing that He is with us every step of the way. I have learned that prayer is not a formula or a magic incantation. It is a relationship, a conversation, an invitation to align with the heart of God. And in that alignment we find peace, we find purpose, we find strength. As I continue on this journey, I know that prayer will never be the same for me. It is no longer a task or a burden. It is a privilege, a gift. And as I walk forward, I carry the lessons I have learned, trusting that God's will is always good, even when I don't understand it. Because prayer is not just about asking, it's about living in the presence of the One who created us, trusting that, no matter what, He is always with us, always listening, always working for our good. And in that truth, I have found the peace that surpasses all understanding. As the years passed, I noticed something truly remarkable beginning to unfold around me. The message I had shared, the one I had once been uncertain about, was beginning to take root in ways I hadn't expected. The transformation I had experienced had started to ripple out into the lives of those I had shared it with, and now they were sharing it with others. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It wasn't just about teaching prayer. It was about living it. The way I prayed, the way I lived, had become the example, and I realized how deeply intertwined those two things were. People were no longer just coming to me for answers. They were coming to me for help in experiencing prayer in a more profound way. They were seeking alignment with God's will, not just answers to their questions. The more they experienced this shift, the more they saw how prayer had been working in their lives all along, even when they couldn't recognize it. I began to hear stories of healing, of breakthroughs, of transformed hearts, not because of miraculous events, but because of a shift in understanding. The shift was in their hearts, in their minds, and in the way they approached God. It wasn't about getting what we wanted. It was about surrendering our desires and aligning with God's greater plan. I had heard of people experiencing a profound sense of peace, even in the midst of their greatest struggles. People who had been in the depths of despair began to realize that God's love and presence were not bound by circumstances. Their prayers weren't always answered in ways they expected, but the peace they found in surrendering to God's will transform their lives. It was an entirely new way of looking at the world, at prayer, at God. Still, the process wasn't perfect. There were people who struggled to grasp the fullness of what I was teaching. Some still wanted the tangible, the immediate, the miraculous answers that they could see and touch. They didn't understand why prayer sometimes seemed to be answered slowly, or in ways they couldn't understand. There were moments when I felt frustrated, like I was speaking to a wall, but then I remembered the truth that had set me free. Prayer is not about what we get from God. It is about how we align with Him. It's not about asking for things. It's about asking for His will to be done, and trusting that He will do what is best for us. It's a continuous conversation, an ongoing surrender, and the peace that comes from knowing that, regardless of the outcome, we are in God's hands. I found myself turning inward more frequently, checking my own heart, asking myself if I had truly surrendered my will. When I felt that familiar doubt creeping back in, I reminded myself that it wasn't about understanding everything. It was about trusting the one who understood it all. There were still moments when I felt weary. I wasn't immune to struggles, to moments of darkness. But those moments didn't have the same power over me as they once did. When I felt myself sinking into despair, I could reach for God through prayer, not as a last resort, but as a continual lifeline. It wasn't about escaping the pain. It was about meeting God in the middle of it. It was about knowing that, no matter what, He was with me. And then there were the moments when I saw the impact of this new understanding in others. I remember a conversation with a woman who had been struggling with grief for years. She had lost her son in a tragic accident, and for so long she had prayed for healing, for some kind of answer, but the pain had never seemed to ease. But now, as she shared with me, she had begun to pray differently. "I don't pray for healing anymore," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I pray for peace. I pray for alignment with God's will. I don't understand why it happened, but I trust that God knows what's best. I feel His presence with me more now than I ever have before." Her words hit me with such power. This woman, who had endured more pain than I could even fathom, had found the peace I had been searching for. It wasn't in the answers she had been praying for. It was in the surrender, in the trust that God's plan was greater than hers. It was in the peace that came from knowing that, no matter what, God was working behind the scenes, weaving a tapestry of divine love and purpose. That moment stayed with me. It reminded me that prayer was not just about speaking to God. It was about listening, about aligning ourselves with His will, and trusting that He was always with us, even in the hardest moments. As I continue on this journey, I see more and more how prayer has the power to change lives, to shift hearts, to align us with God's greater purpose. It isn't always easy. There are still times when I struggle to surrender, when I question why things happen the way they do. But I've learned that those moments are part of the process. Prayer is not about perfection, it's about trust. And I believe with all my heart that as we continue to pray in alignment with God's will, we will see transformation, not just in our own lives, but in the world around us. The power of prayer is not in what we ask for, but in how we surrender to God's plan. In the end, it's not about our will, it's about His. And in that surrender, we find peace, we find purpose, and we find the strength to continue, no matter what challenges we face. Because we know that, no matter what, God is always with us, always listening and always working for our good. As I journey deeper into this understanding, I realized that this wasn't just a spiritual transformation. It was a profound shift in how I viewed every aspect of life. Prayer, which had once been something I felt I had to do, had become something I could no longer live without. It wasn't confined to quiet moments of solitude. It had become my constant companion, woven into every interaction, every thought, every decision. I began to realize that prayer wasn't just about moments of asking. It was about creating a posture of openness to God throughout my entire life. At first, I had thought that this shift in my approach to prayer meant that I would no longer experience doubt or struggle. I imagined that by aligning with God's will, everything would fall into place. But as I continued to live this truth, I realized that the essence of prayer wasn't in avoiding pain or suffering. It was in encountering them with God by my side. Life didn't get easier. The struggles didn't disappear. But now, I had a deeper sense of purpose and peace in the midst of those struggles. I understood that prayer didn't change the external circumstances. It changed the heart. It was a continual process of surrender, of allowing God's will to be done in me and through me. Prayer, I learned, is as much about what we give to God as it is about receiving from Him. I began to see people differently. Where I once saw frustration, I now saw opportunities to pray for alignment. Where I once saw a need, I now saw an invitation to trust God's provision. I began to understand that prayer didn't just have to be about asking God for help. It was about asking God to help me see the world as He does, to help me understand His will in the lives of those around me. There was a particular moment that cemented this new perspective for me. I was sitting in a crowded room, listening to someone share their struggles. They spoke of their pain, their hurt, and their frustrations, and I could feel their desperation. For the first time, I didn't immediately think about what I could say to fix things. Instead, I felt the prompt of the Holy Spirit within me, urging me to pray, not for answers but for understanding. As I sat there, silently praying, I felt an overwhelming sense of compassion for this person. I didn't have the answers to their struggles, but I knew that, in this moment, my role was not to fix their situation, but to intercede for them, to align my heart with God's and trust that He was already at work. I prayed for peace, for wisdom, for God's presence to be known in their life. And as I prayed, I realized something profound. Prayer had become not about changing the situation, but about changing me. It had become about inviting God's presence into the situation, knowing that He was always working, even when I couldn't see it. In that moment, I realized that the most powerful prayer is not one that demands change, but one that submits to God's will and seeks to understand His heart. It's not about controlling the outcome. It's about trusting that God knows the outcome and will work through whatever circumstances we face. But what truly amazed me in this experience was how God had used that simple act of surrender to open my eyes to His heart for this person. I didn't have the answers they needed, but I could offer them the presence of God, which was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. I had learned that prayer, when offered in humility and surrender, had the power to bridge the gap between the pain of this world and the hope of the kingdom of heaven. The more I reflected on this, the more I realized that prayer wasn't just a way to align ourselves with God's will. It was a way to help others align with His will too. We are called to be intercessors, standing in the gap for those who cannot pray for themselves, praying for their hearts to be open to God's love and will. It is not our words that make a difference. It is God's presence that transforms hearts. Over time, I began to see this transformation spread, not just in individuals but in entire communities. Churches and groups I had been a part of began to pray differently. They no longer saw prayer as a way to ask for specific outcomes, but as an opportunity to align with God's will. They prayed for God's heart to be revealed, for His kingdom to come in their lives, and for His will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. There was a moment when I stood before a congregation, and realized that what I was witnessing was nothing short of a miracle. People who had once prayed out of desperation now prayed with a sense of peace and purpose. They no longer felt like victims of their circumstances. They felt empowered by the presence of God in their lives. It was as though the very act of aligning their hearts with His had changed their perspective on everything. In the midst of all this change, I found that the more I aligned myself with God's will, the more I experienced His presence in tangible ways. It wasn't just in the quiet moments of prayer. It was in the interactions with people, the decisions I made, the challenges I faced. Every moment became an opportunity to invite God's presence into my life and the lives of those around me. And the more I did that, the more I saw the fruit of prayer in action. I had come to understand that prayer was not a means of avoiding life's difficulties. It was the means by which we invite God's perspective, power, and presence into our struggles. And in that invitation, we begin to see things differently. We begin to see His hand at work, even in the midst of pain, even in the midst of confusion. And so the journey continued. There were still doubts, still struggles, still questions. But I had learned that prayer wasn't about having all the answers. It was about living in the mystery of God's will, trusting that His love for us would always guide us, no matter where the journey led. In the end, I learned that the power of prayer is not in what we say, but in who we invite into our lives. It's not about the words we speak, it's about the hearts we open to God. And in that openness, we find the peace that surpasses understanding, the joy that comes from knowing that, no matter what happens, God is always with us, working in us and through us. That is the power of prayer, His presence, His peace, His will. And in surrendering to that, we find the true meaning of life itself. As the journey of living in alignment with God's will continued, I began to realize that prayer was not only transforming my own life, but was also reshaping the world around me in ways I couldn't have imagined. What had once felt like a solitary practice, confined to quiet moments of personal reflection or petition, had now become a living, breathing part of my existence. It was no longer something I turned to only when I needed something, or when life felt out of control. It had become the very foundation of how I approached everything. The beauty of prayer, I realized, was that it wasn't something we did for a moment, but something that changed our entire approach to life. As I prayed for alignment, I began to see how deeply connected our individual prayers were to the collective experience of God's people. My prayers, my daily surrender to His will, were part of something larger, something more expansive than I had ever realized. Every prayer I spoke, no matter how small, was a part of the tapestry of God's kingdom, a contribution to His divine plan that transcended time and space. And yet, in this realization, I also understood something profoundly humbling. Prayer is not just about our alignment with God's will. It is also about how our prayers invite others into that same space of surrender and alignment. The more I prayed in this way, the more I saw how deeply interconnected we all are. When one person prays, when one person surrenders to God's will, that prayer has the power to ripple out and affect the lives of others. I had seen this firsthand in the lives of those around me. Families that were once fragmented by anger and pain began to experience reconciliation, not because they had fixed everything, but because they had started to pray differently. I saw marriages healed not by simply asking for change, but by both spouses aligning their hearts with God's will and praying for each other with the heart of surrender and love. Communities that had been divided by bitterness and judgment began to come together in unity, not because they saw eye to eye on every issue, but because they began to pray with hearts of compassion and understanding. Prayer, I saw, had the power to not only transform individuals but to change the very fabric of relationships, of communities. And then, one day, As I was reflecting on all that had changed in my life, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I had been given a gift, the gift of understanding the true power of prayer, and with that gift came a responsibility to share it not just through words but through action. I realized that prayer wasn't meant to be kept to ourselves. It wasn't just a personal tool for transformation. It was a means by which we could invite others into the fullness of God's presence, into the peace and joy that came from surrendering to His will. This became the next step in my journey, to teach others not just how to pray, but how to live prayerfully, how to align their lives with God's will in every moment. It was no longer enough for me to simply pray on my own and wait for change to come. I was being called to invite others to pray with me, to show them how powerful it could be when we prayed in unity, when we prayed for each other, when we prayed not just for what we wanted, but for what God desired. And so, I began to teach others to pray differently, not by focusing on their needs but by focusing on God's heart. I showed them how to surrender their will, how to seek God's will, and how to invite His presence into every situation, no matter how difficult or challenging it seemed. I watched as lives were transformed, not by the prayers themselves, but by the willingness to surrender, to trust that God knew what was best, to believe that His plan was better than any of our own. And as I taught, I saw something incredible unfold. The more I gave this gift away, the more I experienced it myself. As I helped others find the peace that came from surrender, I found my own heart aligning more closely with God's. As I prayed with others, I felt His presence more powerfully than I had ever felt before. And the more I shared, the more I realized that this journey, this life of prayer, was never meant to be a solitary one. It was meant to be shared, to be lived together, in community, in unity, and in love. I began to see that prayer is not just an individual act. It is a communal practice, a gift we give not only to God but to each other. It is the way we carry each other's burdens, the way we stand in the gap for those who cannot pray for themselves, the way we intercede on behalf of the world. It is the way we show up for one another, the way we extend God's love and grace to those around us. As I watched this transformation unfold in the lives of others, I was reminded of the words of Jesus, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them." I realized that prayer, when done in unity, in surrender, was not just a personal practice. It was the very means by which we invited the presence of God into our midst. In that unity, in that shared prayer, we experienced His presence in a way that was more powerful than anything we could have done alone. The more I experienced this truth, the more I understood that prayer is the heartbeat of the kingdom of God. It is the way we align ourselves with His will, the way we invite His presence into every part of our lives, the way we serve others, and the way we change the world. It isn't just a way to get what we want. It is a way to surrender our hearts to the one who knows what's best. And in that surrender I found freedom. Not freedom from pain or struggle, but freedom to live fully in God's will, knowing that His plan for me is always good, always for my benefit, always for His glory. I realized that, no matter what challenges I would face in the future, no matter what prayers would remain unanswered, I could rest in the peace that comes from trusting Him, knowing that He was always at work, always listening, always loving. As I continued on this journey, I knew that prayer would continue to be the thread that connected everything in my life, the thread that connected me to God, to others, and to the world around me. And as I prayed, I knew that I was part of something much larger than myself. I was part of God's eternal plan, and I had the privilege of being a vessel through which His love and grace flowed into the world.